This
Okay,
conference will
welcome
now be
everyone. Thank you for
recorded.
joining us today. You're on this webinar because you have received one of our HPF project grants. A reminder to put your phone on mute. Today we'll be going over the basic requirements of your HPF grant. And let me get started here. Okay, so we are recording the session so that you can have it for future reference. We'll let you know when a link is available. And make sure to submit questions through the chat box. That's in the lower right corner of your screen. And make sure that you're sending those questions or comments to everybody, not just the presenter. And we will take a break for some questions kind of in the middle of the presentation. So we can actually get you on the phone then as well to ask those questions. But submit them through the chat box if you can so that we can keep up with those as we go along. And so today we'll be reviewing your grant requirements. The grant requirements are the same for all of your various programs, but they may be found in different places within those grant agreements. So we just wanted to make that distinction. If you've had a grant agreement with us before, they're not all identical, so there may be some slight differences between those grant agreements. So just make sure that you've reviewed it in its entirety. And so today we want to emphasize the fact that you need to read your grant agreement from front to back and make sure you're familiar with all the various sections of it. And also make sure that you have a copy of it in your files, paper and electronic. An electronic version is very helpful because you can search that way for something that you're looking for. And make sure you refer to it regularly before you purchase anything, before you hire a consultant. Make sure that you've looked at your grant agreement before any activity. And as always, contact your NPS grant administrator with any questions as often as you need. We have assigned some new grants to different grant managers. So if we have not reached out to you yet, we will very soon. If you need to know still who your grant manager is, just reach out to any of us on staff and we'll help you. And we'll direct you to the right person. So a reminder that you should submit just about everything to us in a draft format for approval before moving forward with a grant activity. So basically, when in doubt, just send us a copy so that we can review it. And get help from professionals. And we want to remind you that that can almost always be an eligible cost that can be charged to the grant. So if you need some accounting assistance or a project manager, talk to us about that so that you can make sure you're drawing on the expertise that you need. And so all of the grants that you've received are funded through the Historic Preservation Fund. It was established in 1976. And it's the major source of federal preservation assistance. And we receive up to $150 million a year. That is the cap. And funding comes from offshore oil and gas revenues, not taxes. And so the concept there is that by extracting one non-renewable resource, we can at least help the preservation of other irreplaceable resources. And a number of specific requirements apply to all grants because they were awarded through the HPF. And so we want to talk about some important sources of information that will help you as you look at different aspects of your grant, starting with the uniform guidance. And that contains the cost principles, audit requirements, and so this is an invaluable resource that applies to all federal grants, and it will help you answer a lot of questions that you might have about things like purchases and procurement. It's a set of authoritative rules and regulations from OMB, and you can search it online. You can basically just search for 2 CFR 200 and you'll find a searchable PDF that's helpful to have saved somewhere. The HPF manual, that's also available on our website. You can see that link here on the screen, and that provides the framework for the operation of the HPF and our various grant programs. The Secretary of Interior standards, we want to make sure that you're familiar with those. Those are the guidelines that your project must adhere to. And we're going to talk about that more in, specifically later on, but we want to call that out as a link and that set of standards that you should be familiar with. And so your grant agreement incorporates the requirements from those various sources, and the grant is our Department of Interior's template. And so it provides a lot of those federal requirements, but then also under Attachment A, we have provided very specific HPF requirements that apply to your grants. Just wanted to point out our various grant managers, and after their name and contact information, the programs that they're primarily responsible for. So again, my name is Marla Collum, and I'm working on the Historic Revitalization Subgrant Program, and also Save America's Treasures and a few African American civil rights projects, for example. So you'll see that there are several of us working on different programs. Just wanted you to be familiar with who we are, but again, your grant manager will reach out to you specifically. Megan Brown is our chief, and also under Section 106 and NEPA, we have Olivier Brunet and Jennifer Wellick. Jennifer will be speaking in just a little bit, and we wanted to call out the fact that we have a general inbox, stlpg@nps.gov, and that is our general mailbox that you can always send any type of request to, and we'll get it to the right person. So can I remind people on the phone to mute so that we don't hear your background noise? Thank you. And then for statement of work, budget, and period of performance, these are items that'll be found in your grant agreement. So the statement of work, again, must be performed in accordance with the Secretary of Interior standards, so make sure you're familiar with those. We can modify your scope of work, but we can't change it, because remember that your application was submitted and judged, and you were awarded a grant based on that statement of work and the type of project that you were proposing. So a modification request can be made if you need to make some minor adjustments, but again, contact your grant manager and we can talk through the revisions that you're looking to make. The budget as well is also included in your grant agreement. This is what you submitted with your application, and it separates out the federal or the award portion and the matching share that you either are have secured or are offering to provide. And the federal and matching share can be used for any allowable cost. And ideally, like we say here, they're expended at the same rate, but this is not a requirement. We like you to generally tap into those funds at the same rate if possible. And it separates out administration and program costs. Now we're going to talk about this in more detail in a little bit, but per statute, there's a 25% max of your total budget that may be used for administration costs and indirect costs combined. So again, we'll define that later, but your approved budget would need to adhere to that. The period of performance, these are the start and end dates that are provided in the grant agreement. And keep in mind that we can extend the end date, but you must submit a request along with the reason for needing more time for the period of performance. They can be extended for either 6 months or a maximum of 1 year at a time. And we need you to submit those at least 3 months prior to the grant expiration. We need to have the extension in place before the period of performance expires. And very important to keep in mind that the maximum grant length is 5 years. So after 5 years, that funding has to be returned to the Treasury. So if you're coming up anywhere close to that, make sure that you're planning ahead and looking for ways to complete that grant within 5 years, or we unfortunately lose that funding. And I am going to turn it over to Ginger Carter now to talk about financial requirements.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so for financial requirements, we're going to look at allowable and unallowable costs, indirect costs, administration costs, matching share, risk level, and payments. So we'll begin with allowable costs. So all costs charged to your grant must be necessary, allowable, allocable, and reasonable. And I'm going to go through each of those one at a time. So necessary means that it must be required as part of your project. So if you're doing repair work to a house and you want to install an interpretive sign about the house, that would be a nice addition, but it's not necessary to the project. It has to be allowable, which means that it is not listed as an unallowable cost in the HPF grant manual or under 2 CFR 200. Now, if you have any questions about whether a cost is allowable or unallowable, you can certainly contact your grant administrator and we will help you determine that. But you can also take a look into CFR yourself and just do a search for allowable costs and see what you can find out. Costs have to be allocable, which means if you are charging the cost for something like accounting, where your office has many grant projects and you just want to charge part of what the accounting department does to oversee your grant project, you have to have a way to accurately measure the amount of time that that person is spending on doing work on this grant. So if it is an indirect cost, which a lot of allocable costs are, it's already divided up. So indirect costs may be charged because they are, you have an agreement with your government agency as to how to allocate those to the different grant projects. Also, costs have to be reasonable, meaning they would not be more than what a prudent person would pay for a service or good at a given time. And now below that, we have written the resources for identifying allowable costs, and that is Chapter 13 of the HPF Grant Manual, 2 CFR 200, Subpart E, and again, your grant manager. So grant requirements that are in your grant are reimbursable and allowable, and some of these requirements include liability insurance, the cost of installing a project sign, or conducting audits. Equipment is also allowable, however, it requires prior NPS approval, and without that approval, we cannot reimburse you for that cost. So, and just to clarify, equipment is tangible property having a useful life of more than 1 year and a per unit cost of $5,000 or more per unit. So if you're buying a bunch of windows for a rehabilitation, the overall cost for that might be $20,000, but each window may be $2,000. So that would not be considered equipment because each window is $2,000. So you're just looking at per unit cost. Allowable cost or unallowable costs. These are some of the most common unallowable costs that we see. And those are costs that are incurred prior to the grant award, although sometimes we will allow these to be counted as matching share, but they would have to be incurred within the previous year, and that would have to be with the approval of your grant administrator. Fundraising and lobbying costs are never allowable. Any work you do that does not meet the grant requirements will not be reimbursable. Equipment that was not pre-approved by NPS. The value of any cost that's beyond what is reasonable. Any cost that is also charged to another funding source. So if you have multiple grants for your project, you have to make sure that you are only charging each part of the project to one grant. You cannot double dip. And travel costs beyond the federal per diem. And you can find per diem costs at the GSA website that is listed there. Indirect cost rate agreements. So as we mentioned before, only 25% of your grant can go towards indirect costs and administration costs. So indirect costs are the costs that are incurred for a common or joint purpose benefiting more than one cost objective and that are not readily assignable to the grant without effort disproportionate to the results achieved. So again, this is that allocable issue. But if you did submit an indirect cost rate with your application and we approved it, it's stated in your grant agreement, and that is the rate at which you must use. When that agreement expires, you have to submit any new indirect cost rate agreements you get to the NPS as soon as you receive them. If you applied to use the 10% de minimis rate, we also noted that in your application. But just remember that if you use that rate, you must be able to accurately calculate and track the de minimis rate. It's not an easy thing to do. The definition of it is in 2 CFR 200.68. And sometimes this is when I recommend that people use an accounting firm to help them track their costs. Administration costs. I'm going to read this. It's a little bit long, but just bear with me. Administration costs are allowable, reasonable, and allocable costs related to the overall management of activities directly related to finance, general administrative salaries and wages, and other overhead functions. Not directly attributable to specific program areas identified in the grant agreement. All administrative costs reported must be absolutely necessary for the project or the program implementation, such as the cost items identified in the final grant agreement or items otherwise approved in writing by the NPS awarding officer. It's a long explanation, but I think it helps you to clearly define what duties you're doing that are to be considered administrative. And so what you want to make sure is that you are tracking those separately from your program work. Matching share. Matching share may not be a requirement of your grant program, but if it is, it'll be stated in the grant agreement. And all matching share has to meet the same rules that your federal share does. Basically, once your matching share is under the grant agreement, it's all considered one pot of funds, so they are all subject to the same rules and regulations. Again, match is ideally expended at the same rate as the federal share, but not necessarily required. Matching share has to be reported on all financial reports. So you'll have interim reports throughout your grant project, and each time you have to be tracking the amount of matching share you are expending. Matching share cannot include funds or federal pass-through, other federal funds, or pass-through, except for community development block grants. And just remember, if you have matching share from other sources, it may come with its own set of requirements or regulations that also have to be met. So you don't want to ignore their requirements just because you received this money. Whenever we received your application, we did what we call a grantee risk assessment, and that determination of your risk level is stated in your grant agreement, and you're either listed as a low, medium, or high risk grant. And what we base this risk assessment on is on your single audit, or if you did not submit a single audit, your responses to our DOI financial questionnaire. And in that case, you would have had somebody from our office call you and go through a series of questions. So based on your risk level, you may have additional requirements. If you're low risk, there are probably no additional requirements. If you're a medium risk, typically we have you submitting a form SF-270, which is a request for advance or reimbursement, to your grant manager for approval prior to drawing down any funds in your ASAP grant account. If you are rated as high risk, you usually have to submit the SF-270 along with backup documentation supporting the payment request. Now, if you are a high-risk grantee, don't take that as meaning that you are a bad grantee. It just means you probably have less experience, and so it requires a little more oversight on our part. The ASAP payment system is the system we use to get you your money. So if you have not registered yet with ASAP, you definitely want to do that now because we have no other way of getting you your funds. Whenever you go into ASAP to register, you have to be registered with the National Park Service. You may have other grants with other federal agencies in ASAP, but that does not automatically mean that we can get you money. You actually have to be registered with the National Park Service. So go in and make sure you can see that your funds are there. If you can't, then you need to do something, either finish your registration process or you need to start it again. The registration steps have to be completed within 45 days or you have to start it all over again. But we have a link there to go.nps.gov/pay, and that's where the instructions are. And once you are in ASAP, you do have to go into it every 60 days in order to keep your registration alive. Otherwise, when you go in, it'll say something that you have to contact them to get your registration back up and going. But that's easy enough. You just call the ASAP helpline, and they will get you through that. So when you're managing your grant funds, you have to remember that the funds have to be managed in compliance with the generally accepted accounting principles, often called GAAP, and generally accepted government auditing standards. Now, your grant manager is not going to know what these standards are. We are not accountants. But that is why you need to be working with a certified accountant to manage your grants. Grantees also have to make sure they have financial policies in place to ensure that the funds are properly managed. And if your organ doesn't have the necessary financial systems in place, we want you to consider using an accounting or grant management firm to oversee the project funds. In the end, it ends up being less expensive than having to deal with an audit or having to pay back funds because they were not properly expended. And again, you can use your grant funds to hire any assistance you need in managing the grant. Okay, now we're going to look at the deliverables that are under your grant agreement. So the first deliverable is looking at public notices and other printed or electronic media. So anytime you're making a public announcement or producing a printed material or electronic material, you should submit drafts to the NPS prior to that so that we can look it over and make sure it has the required acknowledgements. If you notice in your grant agreement, we do require that you make a public notice of the award within the first 30 days of receiving the grant. And so hopefully all of you have done that by now, but if not, please work with your grant administrator to get that done. And one thing to note about that is you cannot just put out a press release on the wire. It actually has to be posted into a major area news source, which is typically your biggest newspaper. And it just has to have information that you were awarded the Save America's Treasures grant through the National Park Service for whatever amount it was to do whatever the project is. And then it has to have contact information for your organization so that anyone in the public with questions can contact you. All public materials have to include the disclaimer and acknowledgement that you see listed on the slide. And you don't want to publish anything that implies NPS endorses your organization or a particular consultant or contractor working on the project. It's also illegal to use the NPS logo head without written permission. And NPS should be invited to all events regarding this grant project. So if you're doing a public notice of a public event, make sure to include your grant manager on that. Liability insurance. In your grant agreement, it shows that you're required to have a minimum of $1 million of coverage per incident or $3 million aggregate in liability insurance. And what we do is we require you to submit a copy of your liability certificate to us so that we can look it over and make sure that it meets that requirement. It also states that NPS be added as a co-insured on that insurance policy. If your university or government agency is self-insured, you can contact your grant manager to see if there are any other acceptable insurance documentations. If you are doing a history project or something that does not involve any type of construction or activity where people will not be injured, you can talk to your grant manager and we can look at a reduction in the amount of liability insurance that is required. You do have to keep the liability insurance throughout the life of the grant agreement. And this requirement flows down to all the contractors and sub-grantees under your grant. So as the primary recipient, you would be responsible for making sure any contractor or sub-grantee has the proper liability insurance. Each grant has a different set of grant products that will be produced, but they are listed in your grant agreement. Again, drafts of grant products typically have to be reviewed by NPS at the 50% development mark. This way we can ensure that you're following all the grant requirements. And review of grant products can take 1 week to 3 months based on the complexity and type of the review. So if you're sending us a press announcement, we can do that quickly. You'll get a response, in a day or two. However, if we're reviewing your plans and specs for a large rehabilitation, that could take up to 3 months. So you just want to be able to build that into your timeline. Sorry, looks like our screen is having its own mind. And regarding interim reports, you do have to submit those even if no work has taken place during the reporting period. If nothing else, you're reporting that nothing has taken place, but this way we know that you're still aware of the project and you can let us know about any delays that are going on and show that you haven't drawn any additional funds. I'm going to ask that people who have called in on the phone check to see that your phone is muted. We're getting a little bit of feedback here. On your interim report, you want to provide detail about the progress you're making during the reporting period. You want to note any problems that you're having so that we can address those as early as possible. You can also include requests for equipment or modifications to the budget, scope, or the period of performance within the interim report. And we like to see photos included with with the interim reports. That way we can see what's going on. And if you can include a photo caption and photo credit, that also helps us. Any photos you do submit to us, we might be able to use on our NPS website, which gives you a little publicity. And we do retain the right to use the photos that are submitted. One thing is, if you are having a big problem or facing some kind of emergency, please don't wait for the interim report to contact your grant agreement. Give them a call and deal with that as soon as possible. And so with financial reports that go with the interim and final report, you're always going to have an SF 425 federal financial report. And basically that is just showing how much money you have drawn down from your ASAP account using the federal funds. You're reporting on how much matching share you've used, and you're also documenting the amount of indirect costs you've expended. If there are any budget changes or issues, you can report those in the interim report. And then what we do whenever you submit any changes is we compare that to the budget you submitted with your application to see if there's any modifications that have to be done. And at the end of the grant, we look at your final budget just to make sure that everything lines up with the work that you have done. This is a list of some statistics you might want to track because they'll come out in your final report. So this includes the number of hours of employment that were funded through this project, the number of people accessing information or the site in the next year and the next 5 years, any key partners and participants that were part of the grant project, contributions made to the community by the project, any plans for ongoing funding, expansion, or modification or replications, future public outreach activities, and any major obstacles you face during the grant. Okay, with that, we're going to move on to procurement, consultants, and contractors. So, for procurement, all non-state grantees must follow the federal procurement procedures, which are under 2 CFR 200.320, unless your procurement policies are more strict. Whenever you're dealing with any kind of regulation, you always have to follow the most strict regulation. State grantees should follow their own policies, and that's as per 2 CFR 200.317. For all purchases, you have to maintain documentation showing that the price is fair and reasonable. And I can't tell you exactly what that is. It's going to be different for every type of purchase, but this is something that you have to have so that you can defend yourself in the face of an audit. And all of your purchases should favor American minority-owned businesses if possible. So federal procurement has different levels, and based on the amount of money you're spending, you can follow these different types of procurement. Micro purchases are considered for anything that costs $10,000 or less, and that's if you're buying things. For services, the limit is $2,500, and for any construction work, it's $2,000. But with a micro purchase, you can just go out and purchase the item from whoever you want. As long as it's under that threshold, you don't have to do any competition, you don't have to call around, you can just buy the item from the one place that you find. The next is small purchases, and those are purchases that are between $10,001 or $250,000. And that's going to be probably most of your procurements. With this, you have to contact at least 3 different places to get bids or costs so that you can verify that you are getting the best cost for whatever the item or service is. Again, you want to focus on American-made, minority-owned businesses. Competitive sealed bids are for $250,000 or more, and they require formal advertising. And these are price focused. So if you are bidding out some kind of work and you get 3 bids back and one is $10,000 lower, that is going to be the price, that's going to be the bid that you select. However, with competitive negotiation, which is also for $250,000 or more, these do not have to be formally advertised. You do still have to call around and get a decent number of bids, but here you are basing your selection on qualifications. And this is the type of procurement that is usually used for A&E services. Then you have non-competitive negotiation, which is sole sourcing. And sole sourcing is only allowed in very limited cases. And just 1 second. And let me see. So here we go. It is allowed when there is a physical emergency and there's not enough time to run a competitive bid process. When the item or service is only offered by a single vendor, or after solicitation, you determine that competition is inadequate. So you may try to get 5 bids or 3 bids and you're just not getting anybody except one. And so then you have shown that you have tried to get a certain number of bids, but it's just not working. The other option is if NPS approves the sole source request due to an extenuating circumstance. But this does not include because we've been working with this contractor on the project or the contractor has done work with this project in the past. Those are not considered legitimate reasons for not having an open and free competition. There are different types of procurement contracts, only a few of which are allowed under a grant. The first is the firm fixed price contract. And those are contracts that state an amount that's going to be paid, and that is how much the contractor is going to get regardless of how much work it takes. So if you agree that you're going to pay somebody $5,000 and they end up having to spend an extra week working on it, that price cannot be adjusted. They have to accept the $5,000. Then there is the fixed price incentive contract, and that is a fixed price contract, but it does leave some room for adjustment based on the amount of work or other extenuating circumstances. But they have to be things that can be easily calculated. It can't be, well, we've worked an extra 200 hours unexpectedly, and that goes just far beyond what your budget is. It has to be things that you can reasonably expect to change. And then there are cost reimbursement contracts, and these are only allowable if one of the other 2 contract types cannot be used. And for this type, you would have to talk to your grant manager and get approval to go with it. So now we're going to talk about consultants and contractors. They are people who are assisting with the grant project, and they must have qualifications that meet the Secretary of Interior's standards for professional qualifications. The fields covered are architecture, history, historic architecture, history, and archaeology. And what these qualifications do is they lay out the amount of experience and type of knowledge that these people have to have. Oh, I'm sorry, one more time. We hear somebody's phone ringing, so if that's you, please make sure your phone is muted. You have to submit a copy of the selected contractor's qualifications to your grant manager for review and concurrence. And basically what we're going to do is look to make sure that they meet those professional qualifications. If a contract is funded through the grant funds under your grant, you also have to submit to us a summary of the competitive process you used so that we can make sure that you followed the federal procurement process. You also have to make sure that the contractor does not earn more than the maximum hourly wage of 120% of the salary of a federal civil service at a GS-15 step 10. And that varies from area to area, but if you go onto the OPM website, you can look up your area and see what that salary is. If you're going to do a request for proposals, this is just a short list of things that should be included in that. You want to have a project overview, a little bit on your organization, and you want to list the project goals or the target audience. You want to have a site map or any other helpful project documentation, the scope of work and deliverables, and we recommend that you attach a copy of your grant agreement to the RFP so that they know exactly what is in your grant agreement. You want to have a timeline, a list of any technical requirements that they have to meet, a list of your organization's principal point of contacts, the project budget. You want to mention the type of contract that's going to be awarded, and you have to state the criteria for which the person will be selected. And when you do that, you have to make sure that the way you're selecting them allows for fair competition, that you are not making the requirements so strict that it only allows for one person to apply for that bid. And you also want to state the format and proposal timeline for which they have to submit the RF or their bid. Okay, compensation for personnel services. So personnel are the people who work for your organization, and whenever you are tracking the amount of pay that they make and that it's being charged to the grant agreement, you want to follow these rules. And they are under 2 CFR 200.40. The pay reports must be incorporated into the official office grant records. They must reasonably reflect the employee's total activity. They cannot allow for compensation above 100% of the time. They should encompass both federally assisted and all other activities compensated on an integrated basis. So an auditor wants to be able to look at this and be able to see everything that you're doing and know that you're not overcharging your time spent on working on this particular grant. You want to make sure that you're complying with all accounting policies and practices. And you want to show the distribution of salary or wages among specific activities or cost objectives. So if you are a lawyer working for this company and some of the work you're doing is as a lawyer for this project, you're going to charge your rate doing lawyerly things. But if you're helping the organization stuff envelopes, then you're going to charge the rate at which somebody who is stuffing envelopes should be paid. You would not charge the rate of a lawyer's fee.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. I can
I'm going
hear.
to go over survey and history projects. As with the construction projects, which require adherence to Secretary of Interior standards, other projects such as survey and National Register nominations must also comply to the Secretary of Interior standards and guidelines for archaeology and historic preservations, as well as use appropriate personnel who meet Secretary of Interior's qualification. For instance, archaeology survey projects must be completed by an archaeologist. Architectural surveys must have a historian, etc. Nominations should have an historian. You should submit the qualifications, just a CV or resume, to be approved by your grant manager, even if they are in-house and not a contractor. If submitted with your application, please remind your grant manager that the information is with the application's material. And of course, if the contractor or person conducting the survey changes, you will need to submit new qualifications. When conducting oral histories, NPS expects the grantee will follow best practices set forth by the Oral History Association and must get waivers for those interviews. The website should be listed in your grant agreement. Interviews should be done under the supervision of the oral historian, anthropologist, folklorist, etc., who understands the special nature of conducting interviews. The same goes for videos, which includes interviews. You can have others conduct the interviews, such as students, etc., but should be done with instruction from a supervising professional. NPS also expects that a research design is submitted by the professional indicating the questions and thesis of the project, along with a draft of potential questions for the interviewees. The research design should set out who, what, where, and why, what the researcher hopes to accomplish, how the project will affect the community, and general history. The end report should be prepared to present what was learned and next steps. Next, reviewing best practices for grant records. Remainder of presentation will focus on preservation, development, and pre-development project requirements. Those with history projects may leave their presentation at the best practices, depending on time remaining. We will stop briefly at the best practices to answer questions submitted through the chat box. If time is short, we will either respond to your chat message in the next day or two, or you can contact your grant administrator or the Steel Pig grant inbox with your questions. Best practices. What should be in your grant files? Grant agreement and any amendments, guidance and communication from NPS, financial documentation, receipts, invoices, timesheets, etc. Evaluation criteria for consultants and related documents, review notes, bid documents, reports, interims, final, and financial. What should be in the grant file? Continue. Organizational chart explaining roles of who was involved in managing the grant, any explanatory materials given to the public, any relevant timelines and action plans, canceled contracts, and related explanations. Keep in mind, your grant file should tell your story without having to explain anything. Our job as grant managers is to make sure grantees manage their grant properly and are in compliance with all requirements. A well-managed grant is the best form of advocacy for those grant programs and your best friend during an audit. Record retentions. Best practices after the grant closes. I apologize. Record retention, 3 years for closed grant minimum. Single Audit Act compliance. Non-federal entities are subject to Single Audit Act requirements if they expend more than $750,000 in their fiscal year. This is not optional. See 2 CFR 200 subpart F.
Well, I think we will move on then. I have not opened the the webinar. If you'll hold your questions till we finish construction, we'll go through them all together. So to start, construction projects we call in the government development projects. A development project for some of you is fundraising, but for here we talk about development, that's a bricks and mortar project. So development and pre-development are the terms we use. Pre-development would include plans and specifications, historic structure reports, archaeological studies, and the like. For us, all work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior's standards and guidelines for archaeology and historic preservation. And so that means we don't expect you to be the experts. Some of you on the phone, of course, are, but you would submit them to us for review and approval prior to beginning. If the project would involve any sort of earth moving or demolition, for instance, say you're doing some new driveways or new parking for ADA, you must also use the Secretary of the Interior's archaeological documentation standards. Profits made from any salvage, for instance, have to be reported as program income and deducted from the grant funding. It's very rare, but sometimes happens. Equipment purchased under our grant also requires a disposition instructions from us at the end of the grant, and you have to do an inventory. So in some cases, equipment makes sense. For instance, if you're doing like a large project, if purchase makes more financial sense versus rental, we would be open to that. Just talk to your grant manager. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires that we, as the federal agency, consider effects to our impacts on historic properties. Section 106 says that the Park Service, as the federal agency for this grant, would review all the proposed work to ensure that we will have no adverse effects to any historic properties. Obviously, all of you on the phone have some sort of historic property, so you all fall into this rubric. Even those of you who are doing history projects will still be reviewed. However, you don't need to do many layers of review. Similarly, the National Environmental Policy Act requires that we also review all federally funded work for potential environmentally adverse impacts. And the processes for these will be detailed later. I'll get to it, I promise. All work requires easements or preservation covenants for those that are brick and mortar. And this is because of a section of the Historic Preservation Act that says that you will continue to do the maintenance and repair on administration of any of our grant projects. And that's to protect the federal investment. The easement requirements are in your grant agreement. You can read through that. We always ask that folks do it early. And so you'll see we ask that you will sign a covenant or an easement with your state historic preservation officer, which is in our parlance known as the SHPO, in which the site is located. Or if you have a different agency, some states don't take easements, there'll be a nonprofit preservation organization that will accept the easement. We have to approve any easement holder that's not a SHPO, and the terms of the agreement must be running for, depending on your program. For Save America's Treasures, you have the largest, I think, at 50 years. Some of you on the phone have multiple years of grants, and in that case, we will append more years onto your original grant at the end of each grant. So the easement and must be executed. You actually register it with the deed, and a photocopy of it must be stamped, registered, and submitted to us to actually finish the grant. So that's always part of it. We usually hold back funding until you finally do that to us. So for that, as you can tell, I feel like there might be a lawyer involved, so you might want to start this process early. And if you're not the property owner, you have to involve them in the process from the beginning, as they need to sign. An easement affects their ownership. Submission of any draft easement would be, we probably would want to do that early in the first year so that we can get to any issues that have to be worked out. An issue might be, what exactly is the boundary for this easement? What are we going to be covering? At what point do we take photos? So things like that you want to discuss with your grant manager and also with whoever's going to hold the easement. We have a model easement on our website you can take a look at. Of course, it's just a model, so things change depending on what state you're in and also what type of ownership you have. As we said, the SHPO is typically the holder. That's the State Historic Preservation Office, but some no longer do that, so you'll have to find another agency. And some agencies won't accept an easement without some sort of financial package as well, and that's an eligible grant cost if that's necessary. Easements are registered at the county with the deed, and so they travel with the property if sold. All construction projects require a sign, and in fact some non-constructions do as well. You have to erect the sign prior to beginning the project, and it should be up for the life of the project. Most contain, and it has to have an NPS acknowledgement, and it should also have your contact info should anybody want to know more about the project. And it has to be of a size that can be read easily from the public right-of-way and made of durable material. We don't want to come out to your site and see a piece of paper taped to the front door that says, we acknowledge this funding from the National Park Service. You have to actually make it a real sign. And of course, that sign is an eligible cost. Grantees can make your own sign and send that in for review, or you can use one of our pre-formatted NPS sign. That is the only way that anyone can use the National Park Service arrowhead. You have to use our template if you're going to use the arrowhead. And if you don't want to use our template, then you cannot use the arrowhead. So this is an example of our project sign in our format that has the arrowhead. The benefit of having our logo is that it's instantly recognizable, and it kind of elevates your project. So for those of you, this is one for African American civil rights, and you can see how it would be fill in the blank depending on your grant program and the name. And it has room at the bottom for those architects and contractors and other funders that would be welcome to add to the bottom. So the biggest question I get is, how should we schedule this? In what order should our requirements happen? Obviously, I'm not talking about all your other requirements that Ginger and Marla and Demetra all went through in detail. What I'm talking about is for construction. So we want to see the press release notification. That's 30 days, within 30 days. Ginger talked about that. Liability insurance, we'd like to see within 60 days, certainly before any site visits or work on the project. Remember, this is a construction project, and it's a federal one at that. So you want to protect yourself from anyone walking on site. If the site is open to the public, if it's somewhat accessible, then you'll want to apply for some sort of security. Project sign has to be installed before you start to work, and then you'd want to submit to us your consultant qualifications. You're going to submit these prior to selection on your end. Don't wait and say to us, oh, I already chose them, because we may have some disagreements. The Park Service can pick the best qualified, not the least cost, unless that's your local procurement law. And then, of course, we want that draft easement 1 year from when you started and the final easement before we finish. So let's talk about the thing everyone loves, review and compliance, Section 106, NEPA, and other federally required reviews, as well as the technical review for construction projects. Every time a federal agency has any sort of funding, licensing, or permitting, it triggers several different reviews. From the Park Service, it requires some help, though, from you, the grantee. So the Section 106 review comes out of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. There's a Section 110 review if your building is a National Historic Landmark or a contributing building in a National Historic Landmark district. Some of you on the phone are likely NHLs right now. There's a National Environmental Policy Act review, that's known as the NEPA review. And again, for this, we can't do it alone, so we need your help. So part of what I'm showing you is what the federal agency must do, but it also is how it impacts your project. So for us, we have to determine which properties in the project area may or may not be affected by the project. We have to determine if those things inside what we call the area of potential effect, the APE, are either listed on the National Register or eligible for listing on the National Register. And those would be historic properties in our definition. Then we have to decide how would that historic property be affected by your project. And should there be any likely adverse effects, we'd have to look at ways we could take to avoid them. We in this division do not like to fund anything that's an adverse effect, and in fact we shouldn't. So we'd like to reach an agreement with the State Historic Preservation Office or the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, as well as the Advisory Council in some cases, to reach a measure to resolve an adverse effect. It is very unlikely we'll fund any such thing. We're going to talk about public consultation in a section. So here's National Environmental Policy Act reviews. Passed in '69, it's the country's environmental policy and includes the goal of achieving productive harmony between human beings and the physical environment. NEPA, like 106, is triggered by federal actions, and for them, it's anything funded in whole or in part, including those carried out on behalf of an agency and financial assistance, obviously. So it's again required of the federal agency, but we are asking for your help in doing this. There's other federal laws that are under NEPA. So there's the Endangered Species Act, there's our Preservation Act is actually covered under NEPA, as well as some secretarial orders and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. So because we don't know the ins and outs of your project the way you do, we ask that you would fill out what we call an environmental screening worksheet. And again, this is only for development projects, pre-development projects that include testing of some sort, like if any of you on the phone are going to do dendrochronology or something like that, and also archaeology. So those are the three that kind of trigger this worksheet. It combines on the worksheet both things that are applicable to the National Environmental Policy Act, but also applicable to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. You'll see it has project information, project descriptions, mandatory criteria. Just the scope of your work when you look at this, just want to remind you, you don't have to assess the world. So if the project is to repair a roof, and the question is, how will this affect the air quality? You might in your mind think, well, you know, I'm going to put down tar, and tar can be a carcinogen, and carcinogens can have air impacts. Don't go down that road. The scope of your work is the roof. And so the building had a roof when it started, and you're going to put a roof back on it. So at that point, you're not going to have any effect to the environment. You're not changing anything with this project. We are seeking to discover if we at the National Park Service can issue a categorical exclusion. They call that a Cat X in the NEPA world, which applies to the work. Our agency has specific categorical exclusions, and we have one that deals with grant projects for restoration, rehabilitation, or preservation. So when you fill out that worksheet, you're helping us decide if we can actually give you an exclusion to the NEPA requirements. And essentially that says the agency has done its due diligence and there will be no effects.
Hi, my name is Olivier. So I work at Steel Pig with all the other people, and I will show you how to do the environmental screening worksheet, as Jen was explaining, that is related to the NEPA regulation. So it's a 5-page document, so it's not very long and doesn't take that long to fill in. So the first part is section A. It's like the project ID. So you would have the project name, the grant number that you would have in your grant agreement, and you check the box if it's a development or archaeological survey. After, you would have section B, which would be a short description of the summary of the project. Usually for your project, we already have a lot of information, but if you could just write a short summary, that would be great. And the next line is to check if you can give us more information, more documents. If you can give us a map, that would be useful. And the good news, it's the next section. Next section is that you don't have to do it, and it's the one related to section 106 of the NHPA. But as I was saying, we will do it for you. Page 2. So it's section D. So it's 20 questions concerning any measurable environmental impact that a project could have. So usually you would say no for all these questions, but if you have any concern, you could ask us and contact us. Because if you say no, if you say yes, excuse me, we cannot claim a categorical conclusion, and we would have to take another path. It would be another process. But again, if you have any concern, you can just ask us. Section E would be another 12 questions. It would be the same process, same thing, but those questions are specific to a national park and our division. And again, if you say yes to any of these questions, contact us, let us know, because it would be another process. The two last questions has to do with, are you familiar with the site, with the building? Do you know the location and the project? And the question 2 has to do with consultation. So there would be where you tell us for any consulting parties. So if you know any alumni, any friends group, any tribes that should be consulted, and that you know about the project, or any other agencies also. After you have this small box for recommended action, there would it would be a drawdown menu, and usually you would choose found project unless you want more assessment. And you have to sign, so it could be your real signature or your name, printed name with a fancy font like in the example here, and signed. And the last page would be the categorical exclusion form. The upper part, it would be great if you could fill in that for us. It would save a lot of time. So basically it would be the same information as the first page, and you don't have to do anything else. We would do the rest of the page, and that's it. We would get back to you with the document and with comment about threatened and endangered species. And for example, if you're doing work, roof work, and your building is in the path of migratory birds, or if there are any bats, endangered bats that's in your area. So it's where we would tell you about it. It's at the bottom of this page.
Thank you, Olivier. This I'm going to come back. This is Jennifer again, and we're going to look at the technical review for the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties. You'll see in your grant agreement, it's another review, and I, of course, will do this at the same time. I promise you, you don't have to submit it again. So when you submit your project to your grant manager and say, we're ready to get rolling, we have our consultant, we have our architect, we can then review the plans and specifications for your project. I'm going to review it for the technical review for the standards, as well as submit it to the State Historic Preservation Office for the 106. So in our division, we can only fund 3 of the 4. So we can do preservation, rehabilitation, or restoration of projects. We don't use reconstruction because we don't pay for that. For us, that's unallowable. Now, if you're doing work and the back wall falls up, we will reconstruct that as part of a rehabilitation or restoration or preservation project. But we won't recreate the lost slave cabin in the back. So just to let you know, for preservation, if those of you on the phone who aren't familiar, it's the retention of buildings or landscapes in a current condition. So that's keeping the building as it is and saying all the periods from its beginning to now are important. Rehabilitations when you want to retain or restore historically significant areas, but you also want to allow some new uses and new systems. We'll probably see this one the most. This is where you want to put in the new kitchen for your event, or add new ADA bathrooms, or maybe a new multimedia space. Restorations when you pick a specific time related to why your building is significant, and you have to have proper documentation for this time period that you pick, and you're going to bring the building or landscape back to that period. And we probably see restoration most as a landscape treatment, where people are, for instance, we had a grant where they were restoring an artist's landscape because that was what that person looked out onto from their studio. So there were quite a few pieces of documentation we could rely on for what plantings existed. So restoration relies on a lot of proper documentation. We ask that you pick, don't go, preservation for the front and rehabilitation in the back. That's the mullet of preservation. Don't do that. So here's the project workflow. This is how I think in an ideal world it would work. You would get your funds, your press release would happen. You would send us, of course, the draft before you put it out there. You'd get your grant. You'd send your draft RFP in for review to your grant manager. You'd start working on your draft easement. You'd figure out who was going to hold that. And in the meantime, you'd also start beginning your procurement process. Then you'd pick, the firm you wanted. You'd send that in to the grant manager for review. We'd approve based on their qualifications that you would submit. You'd start the contracts with that person. Go ahead and start doing your environmental 106 and technical reviews. Then you send that back to us. Project sign goes up, the draft goes to your grant manager to check and see, and he or she says yay or nay. Then you actually start the work. You're exhausted, but you're only just begun. So now you're at step 5, and you'd actually begin the work. And of course, all during this time, you've been doing your reporting, your interim reports, as they are noted in your grant agreement. Finally, you're at the end. You would begin to file your easement with the county courthouse. You'd complete your final project report for us, and you would submit your deliverables. And of course, you'd invite us to the ribbon cutting, because it will be a fantastic project at that point. And then you'll be ready to apply for the next grant. So these are the references for the things I talked about. I did not go into 106 the way I could have. I recommend the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's Citizens Guide that you see here to Section 106. It's helpful. You are now a federal grantee, and as a result, some folks have the right to comment on your project. And so this Citizens Guide tells you what a consulting party could look at should they be interested. And like Olivier said, we're interested in those friends groups and those other folks who have an interest in your building or in your archaeological projects, that they get a voice at the table.